Welcome back. All right, so I've been, watching the playoffs, clearly, obviously, and thinking back to when I was a kid and started watching hockey and which series I really enjoyed the most. Now, it's not necessarily a series that features a team I root for. Very often it could be, but there are times too where my favorite series is just one because I really enjoyed the hockey, I really enjoyed the competitiveness of it, and so I want to talk about it from 1981 through 2000. I picked one series from each year, and then of course I'll do a video as well with 2001 through until say 2020, right? So that being said, we're going to go ahead and start things off with 1981. 1981, it was the Calgary Flames. It was the Philadelphia Flyers. That series went the full seven. Calgary won that series 4-3. My favorite game in that one was Game 5, and it was a 9-4 win for the Philadelphia Flyers. And the reason that one stood out to me is because, to me as a kid, that was just crazy that there were that many goals in a playoff game. And so, the whole idea of the 80s games, it's well-founded. But yeah, that 9-4 win by Philadelphia, just crazy. And then Calgary won that series in 7. It was a lot of fun to watch. It was fantastic. Keep in mind that Philadelphia team in 1981, pretty good. So for Calgary to score that upset, which is exactly what it was, and that was in the quarterfinal. So I'll put underneath that's a quarterfinal matchup. So, final 8 teams, and Calgary made their way to the final 4. Lost in the semifinal, but did pretty well. So yeah. All right, 1982. You got Vancouver, the winning team in a series against the Chicago Blackhawks. So Vancouver won the series 4-1. Now, my favorite series in that is actually Game 2, which was a 4-1 win for Chicago in that conference final matchup, because that's when Towel Power was born. The towels that you were waving at hockey games now, you can thank Roger Nielsen for it. Roger Nielsen put a white towel on a hockey stick and raised it because he felt like the officials were against the Vancouver Canucks that night, and he was just signaling his surrender. So when the Canucks came home for the next game, Canuck fans were waving towels, and Towel Power was born. The Canucks had ended up going to the Stanley Cup as a result of that win over the Chicago Blackhawks in the conference final. They would lose in the Stanley Cup final, but that was one of those just great moments. Absolutely great moments. For 1983, the Edmonton Oilers, and apologies to Hawks fans everywhere, but at Chicago again, this series was a 4-game sweep of the Chicago Blackhawks, and it was Game 2. 8-2 win for the Oilers in what was, again, the conference final. So what we started seeing in the 80s was that the Norris Division, whoever won that division, whoever came out, would get destroyed by whoever won the Smythe. That was the rule, and eventually I was rooting for Norris teams that came out, but it just didn't help. So yeah, the 8-2 win by the Oilers in Game 2 was just this huge statement that they were for real. And it was crazy how easily the Oilers scored in the playoffs. So, 1984, it's the Oilers again. Yep. This time, the victim of the Edmonton Oilers in that playoff was the Islanders. So it was orange and blue versus orange and blue. And my favorite games, it's games actually. Games 3 and 4. Both of those games were won by Edmonton by a score of 7-2 in the Stanley Cup Final. So is it anticlimactic? A little bit, yeah, but that was also kind of a feature at times with the Stanley Cup Final that wasn't really a lot of tension. There was one team that belonged there and another one that maybe didn't. This was not a case of a team that didn't, though. This was the case of an Islanders team that hadn't lost a series in over 4 years, and they were exhausted. And you could see it. The Oilers were just basically ragdolling them that series. Back-to-back 7-2 wins, huge statement. The Edmonton Oilers, until 1984, the statement was basically, well, they can't play defense, so they can't win a Stanley Cup. And then they went out and they won a Stanley Cup in 84. The Oilers also saying that when they lost that Stanley Cup final in 83, that showed them what they needed to do to win. And so they applied some of those lessons in 1985. 1984. Now in 1985, Winnipeg Jets are on the board, and so are the Calgary Flames. So in this series, it was a 3-1 win for Winnipeg because the first round was a best of 5 before the NHL decided we're going to change it. So the game I picked as my favorite in that one, Game 1, 5-2 overtime win for Winnipeg. That is Division semifinal, I believe, is the designation for that. Absolutely, Division semifinal. So that's the first round, Game 1. Calgary loses at home to Winnipeg 5-4 in overtime, and that was an amazing upset. Then in the second round, we don't need to talk about what happened to the Jets in the second round, but as we were getting into the era of the Battle of Alberta, and then there's just kind of everybody else in the division, the Winnipeg Jets kind of wedged themselves in there in 1985 in the playoffs. 1986, it's the Battle of Alberta. Battle of Alberta had to be on this board at least once, right? So 1986, the Calgary Flames knock out the Edmonton Oilers 4-3 in what was a division final matchup. And for me, my favorite game in that series would have been Game 7, a 3-2 win for the Flames. Because until the Flames actually knocked out the Oilers, I didn't think it was going to happen. You had to pick a side between Calgary and Edmonton. I was rooting for Calgary at that point. And so, yeah, I was very happy to see them win. And, of course, the Flames then went all the way to the Stanley Cup Final where they lost against Montreal, which you can throw that into the memory banks because that's going to come up again later in the video. 1987, I'm going with a Norris Division matchup in this one. So Norris Division, you have the Detroit Maple Leafs, you have the Detroit Red Wings and Toronto Maple Leafs. It's one of those things where I just need to breathe, relax, talk slower. All right, so 4-3 series win for the Detroit Red Wings in that one. If I had to go with a favorite game in that series, it would have been Game 4, which was a 3-2 overtime win for Toronto. And again, that's a division final matchup, so what we would now call round 2. But yeah, what a game that was, and what a series that was. The Toronto Maple Leafs in the 80s were a team of, they had some good players here and there, but they weren't necessarily a great team, and the record wasn't usually very good going to the playoffs, but man, were they a tough out in the playoffs. And 87, I was kind of rooting for them to go further, but yeah, that was a great series. And then Detroit, after that win over Toronto, I was really rooting for them against Edmonton. It didn't work out for them against Edmonton. The Oilers weren't being stopped. 1988. So for Habs fans, maybe take a few minutes and go and make yourself a sandwich. So 1988, you'll see why. Boston beats Montreal 4-1 in that series. If I had to pick a favorite series, their favorite game in that series, it's Game 5, 4-1 win for Boston, and that was in Montreal. Now, keep in mind that before 1988, it had been a while since Montreal had lost against Boston in the playoffs. That series as well was the division final, so that's the second round. And yeah, absolutely great series because as a Bruins fan, I was in shock. I had become a Bruins fan that year. My father was a huge Montreal fan. It's part of the reason why I was so just gung-ho with the Bruins. Plus, I didn't have an Eastern Conference team, not really. And so I picked the Bruins. Nordiques were a close second, but of course the Nordiques are no longer around. But yeah, Boston, that was an interesting series. 1988, was that the year that Annie Moog knocks the net off and they didn't call it? He just turned around and knocked the net off because Montreal was going to score. And I turned to my dad and I said, that was really creative on his part. I think that's some really smart goaltending. He got the whistle. I'm still surprised I didn't get launched through a window that day. But anyways, 1988, Boston knocks out Montreal. And again, Game 5, Boston wins in Montreal 4-1. That would be my favorite series. 1989, Calgary's on the board again. And it's Calgary winning a series. Now, one might expect that I'd have Calgary-Vancouver up here. No. Calgary-Vancouver wasn't my favorite series to watch. It was very stressful. The ending of it was one that I wasn't a huge fan of. But by the time we reached the Stanley Cup Final, the question was whether or not Montreal could lose against Calgary because they'd beaten Calgary in 86. And I was a fan of Calgary winning it just because they'd never won it before. So that was a whole debate. And then, really, for me, my favorite game in that series would be Game 6. Because Calgary wins it to win the Stanley Cup. So that's the Stanley Cup Final Series. And the fact they won the Stanley Cup in Montreal, that's insane. Because, yeah, the Montreal Forum was an intimidating place to play. I think they were the first team ever to hold up the Stanley Cup in the Montreal Forum that was not the Montreal Canadiens. I believe that was the selling point in '89 was this has never been done before. So, yeah, Montreal on the board a couple of times. Are they going to be on the board again? Yeah. Yep. 1990. It's Boston. It's Montreal. And again, it's how memorable the series was. It was a 4-1 series for the Boston Bruins as they would go all the way to the Stanley Cup Final. My favorite game in that series would have been Game 2, which was a 5-4 overtime win for Boston. So, and I believe that was division final as well, correct? 1990, yep, division final. So again, in round 2, Boston knocks out Montreal. And again, I know one of these 2 times I actually phoned my dad to see where he was because he didn't come home the night after Boston knocked out Montreal. He did not come home because he knew that his son was sleeping on the couch waiting for him to come home. So he could talk to him about the game. I just wanted to talk to I may have had my Bruins jersey on at the time, sure. I don't understand why he didn't want to come home and talk to me about the game. Habs fans, don't worry. There's no more picking on Montreal here from 88 through 90. Yes. And again, these 2 series I loved, but if you're a Montreal fan, don't worry. My disappointment was in the Stanley Cup Final where combined they won a grand total of 1 game against the Edmonton Oilers in those 2 Stanley Cup Final runs. 1991, and the reason for a Minnesota North Stars jersey. Got to justify wearing the North Stars jersey, right? So now I get back to apologizing to Chicago fans because 1991 it was Minnesota, it was Chicago, and it was a 4-2 series win for the Minnesota North Stars. The North Stars had no business being a playoff team that year, much less going on a run, and they went all the way to the Stanley Cup Final that year. So these people going, oh, this team's mediocre and they shouldn't have made the playoffs. Go back and look at the 1991 stats for the Minnesota North Stars. So Game 5. Game 5 was insane. And I remember laughing a lot because this was a first-round matchup. This was a Chicago team that had Belfour and Roenick, and it had a really fantastic regular season. And then Minnesota in Game 5 beats them 6-0. Where I remember getting a pretty good chuckle about that because that wasn't supposed to happen. It just wasn't supposed to happen. Minnesota goes on a run all the way to the Stanley Cup Final. Yep, they get crushed in the Stanley Cup Final by Pittsburgh. But what a run. And by crushed, I mean in the final game they were crushed. They made it close before that. But yeah, that eventually fell apart. But what a round. That knockout win over Chicago, I was on cloud 9 the rest of that run because I didn't see that coming. 1992. And so don't worry, Chicago fans. You can also win a series and end up on the board today, as is shown by their series against the Oilers. Now, Chicago won that series in 4. So it is one of 2 sweeps on the board thus far. Why would I care? All right, so Game 1. It's an 8-2 win for Chicago, obviously, because it's a 4-game series sweep, and it's a conference final. For that game, I actually watched it with some friends of mine, and one of my best friends was a big Oilers fan. I was not rooting for the Oilers in that series because in 92, like I'm still thinking, the Oilers have won a lot of Stanley Cups in the 80s. I want to see somebody else win the Stanley Cup. Little did I know Pittsburgh was going to win the second of back-to-backs. But I wanted Chicago to have their chance. I felt like Chicago might be able to stop Pittsburgh. They didn't. But, yeah, that first game, it was 8-2. And I will admit that was one of the most fun times I've ever had watching a game. Because my friend didn't swear and was trying to find ways to express her frustration without swearing. And it was an enjoyable... I think she would find it less enjoyable than I did, but... yeah, it was fun sitting with my friends and watching a game and watching Chicago. It wasn't close. And we watched the whole game. That was the fun part. We watched the entire game, but it was not a close game. All right, 1993. So I guess I can apologize to Toronto fans on this one, but this series was great. Like, I understand that the final result they may not have liked, LA wins the series 4-3 and ruins the final that I wanted too. I wanted Montreal and Toronto in that Stanley Cup final as well. But Game 7. Game 7 was such an emotional roller coaster. And keep in mind that for me, I didn't have the emotional investment that others did because I wasn't rooting necessarily for Toronto or for LA. I wanted Montreal Toronto in the final though. And so while I wasn't all that happy with the result, 5-4, that game was crazy, and that series was really, really good. And that is as close as Toronto got to a Stanley Cup, is that one game away from a Stanley Cup final, anyways. And it's too bad if Toronto wins that Game 7 and they play against Montreal, maybe they could have stopped Montreal. Maybe we would be talking about Toronto not winning a cup since '93, but here we are. 1994. So that's the Canucks' big run, and so I had to pick a series. And for the most fun that I had to watch a series, you know what? I'm gonna change my mind midstream on this one. I'm gonna change my name my midstream. I was gonna put Dallas. Full transparency, I was gonna put Dallas. Calgary. I don't need to look this up online or anything. And it's not one game. That would have been the division semifinal. Or conference quarterfinal. At that point, I think they were up to conference quarterfinal. Yeah, it would have been conference quarterfinal because it was 1-8, 2-7, 3-6, and all that. Vancouver was down 3-1 against Calgary. Has to be the series I put on here. They won games 5, 6, and 7 all in overtime. So they became the Cardiac Canucks. It was absolutely insane. I enjoyed the series against Dallas a lot because I just enjoyed the hockey and everything. But yeah, I have to go with that one. I have to. I think I'd have to turn in my Canuck fan card, which some may want me to do anyways. But yeah, that series was insane because every game I kind of expected Vancouver to lose, and they won it. And so my attitude was basically, well, they've given Calgary a good run. Calgary's probably the better team. It's okay, right? But Vancouver came back and they won it, and then they went all the way to the Stanley Cup Final. 1995. This one may surprise people a bit because I've talked about how the Trap came in 1995 and the Devils, and I didn't enjoy the Trap. But that 1995 series between the New Jersey Devils and the Flyers was entertaining. It was a contrast in styles. And I'm going with Game 6, which was 4-2 for New Jersey in a series they won 4-2. And what's interesting is, and this is a conference final matchup to decide who goes to the Stanley Cup Final, that was the first win at home for either team in that series. It was definitely a road series, which is interesting because 2003, we get to the Stanley Cup Final, the home team wins every game, which once we get to 2003, it has a chance of being the series that I pick, but that being said, I'm only going to 2000 in this video. New Jersey, Philadelphia, though, yeah, Game 6, 4-2 New Jersey, the first home win by any team in that series. And it was a very entertaining series from the point of view that the question was, okay, so Lindros is the next guy. Is this where he takes that step? And it just didn't happen. New Jersey knocked them out. 1996 has to be one of the Florida Panther series, doesn't it? Well, it's not going to be the one against Boston, but it's going to be the one against Pittsburgh. That series was absolutely crazy because Florida had a good run going into that series against Pittsburgh, but that was a conference final matchup, and the expectation was the Pittsburgh Penguins were the better team. They were going to knock them out. So, yeah, for me, it was Game 7 was the most memorable, a 3-1 win by Florida in that conference final, put them into the Stanley Cup Final, where they got defeated in 4 straight by the Colorado Avalanche. But still, throwing rats on the ice, that goes back to 1996 before the NHL said knock it off. And I think it was this following regular season they were like, okay, that's enough of that. Well, we're going to do delay game penalties if there's all these rats on the ice. But yeah, Florida had quite the run, and that win over Pittsburgh, I was absolutely shocked by that. I was shocked by their other series wins too, but that one against Pittsburgh, I really felt like Pittsburgh had, should be able to beat Florida. 1997. So 1996 was the start of the feud between the Detroit Red Wings and Colorado Avalanche. So the start of that. 1997, that was a war. That was an absolute war. Now, the best game in that series, oddly enough, wasn't close. It was a 6-0 win for Detroit, obviously conference final. In that 6-0 win, there were 234 penalty minutes. Everybody was fighting in that game. It's kind of a surprise the coaches didn't just jump on the ace and start fighting. That was really quite the blood feud. What's interesting to me is that it feels like the Detroit-Colorado rivalry didn't last as long as it may feel like it did, just because those matchups were so intense. They were so intense over that few years that rivalry was really heated up. Of course, Dallas would get in and make it kind of a three-way rivalry, but it wasn't like a blood feud with Dallas against Colorado or Detroit. But yeah, Detroit and Colorado didn't like each other. That series was very, very entertaining because for me, as a fan, I didn't really necessarily care who won. I enjoyed the action. 1998. So the Ottawa Senators went into this series with no one expecting them to win it that I can remember, but they did. They won it 4-2 over the New Jersey Devils. My favorite game in that series, 2-1 overtime win for Ottawa, which was, and this was in the first round, right? Yeah, conference quarterfinal. So the Ottawa Senators went into that 1998 playoff with no expectation, and they won it. And yeah, the Ottawa Senators had been basically a terrible franchise that first couple of years. And then, of course, they draft Dag. Dag didn't work out. They would have problems with Yashin in the playoffs. But, man, that series was absolutely great. So I have no complaints at all that once Ottawa got themselves in order and got into the playoffs, they were pretty tough out. 1999. So it kind of has to be a Dallas series, doesn't it? It's Dallas on one side, and it is Colorado on the other. So that series was 7 games, I do believe. Yep. So 7 games. And my favorite game in that series would have been Game 7 because 4-1 win for Dallas. Conference final matchup. They went to the Stanley Cup Final where they won against Buffalo. You would think the Stanley Cup Final would be, as a Dallas fan, the one that I enjoyed the most, but no, Dallas, Colorado, because it felt like Dallas, Colorado was the Stanley Cup Final. That was an era, too, where once you get into this, where it felt like, hey, whichever 2 teams in the West are left standing for that conference final, that's your real Stanley Cup. The Stanley Cup finalists, the team that comes out of the East is fine, but yeah, likely that your Stanley Cup final winner is going to be the team out of the West. So when I see that argument now for the East, and I see it a lot, I remember when it was the West that everybody, feared the most. Which brings us to 2000, and in 2000, I'm going with a series that, for me as a fan, ended up being ultimately a disappointment. But I couldn't be mad at Dallas, not in the slightest. They do lose the series 4-2, but they gave it their all. Game 5, 1-0 win for Dallas in triple overtime. So that triple overtime win kept Dallas alive. They would lose Game 6, but nothing but respect for the team being willing to go out, put out that effort, and win in that third overtime. So it was a low-scoring series at points, but it was a fun series to watch. So there you go. My favorite series, one from each year from 1981 through 2000. I will do this for 2001 through until, like I said, 2020, because that'll be 20 years. And yeah, we'll see what I come up with for that. But I thought this would be a fun video to do today because we're getting the playoffs started. And I did check, and I could not find that I've done a video exactly like this. Doesn't qualify as a Madness video, I don't think. I don't think there's enough magnets, but you guys can let me know your thoughts. And yeah, so let me know your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't already hit like and subscribe, please do. So yeah, I'm old. All right, thank you guys for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.